The broadcast is now starting.
This afternoon webinar on ransomware, what is it, and how to minimize your chances of being its next victim. Before we get started, I just wanted to point a few things out to you. We're going to have the lines muted, but in the event that you have any questions for our panelists, feel free to type in your questions. I'll be more than happy to interrupt and ask the questions out on your behalf. To the right of you, there's a GoToWebinar toolbar. There are different tabs. There's a question tab, and that's where you can type in your questions. If you would like to ask the question directly, just raise your hand. There's an icon where you can raise your hand on the toolbar, and what I could do is unmute you, and then you can ask the question directly. For some of you have dialed in, others are using the audio on your computers. One thing you should be aware of and check is sometimes there will be you have speakers, but you may not have a mic, and in that case you won't be able to ask your questions. So you might want to check that out. We will unmute the phones at the end of the session or when we're prompted by our panelists. We're going to go ahead and get started here, and I am going to pass this over to our panelist, Tim Hancock. He's a senior network engineer here at Nims and Associates.
Thank you, Henry. First of all, just hope everyone can hear me here. So thank you, Henry, for the introduction. And as the title of our webinar is Ransomware, what is it and how to minimize your chances of being its next victim. I'm going to go into just a quick definition of what ransomware is, and then we're going to look at some history of ransomware, where this kind of came from, where we've gotten to today. We'll look at some examples of it, some different ways that you can get infected by it, and then we'll talk about some of the different things we can do to help prevent infections and help prevent the spread of this. We'll also show a couple of examples of bigger organizations in the news that have been affected by this as well. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in and get started here. So ransomware. So here's our definition, and then we're going to go ahead and talk about what all this really means. So ransomware is malicious code that uses advanced encryption algorithms to block system files and demand payment in return for the key that can decrypt the blocked content. So great, we've got a definition, and we're going to talk about what that all really means to everybody. But before we do that, we're going to kind of go into a little bit of a history on this. We've got an evolution on ransomware. When this really first came out, the first evolutions of this really revolved around the fake antivirus pop-ups. Those really kind of came back, maybe 2007, 2008, 2009, back in that time frame, where you would get a pop-up on your computer, saying you've got, 2,000 infected files or something on your computer, and it would demand a payment to go ahead and clean your computer. That was, at the time, something that was actually fairly successful for these ransomware writers. The FBI estimated that back in 2009, they made $40 to $100 off of everyone who paid for that, and that they made about an estimated $150 million off of that. Then our next kind of thing that came up was actually a ransomware, and that was actually where you would get a message popped up that would actually say your screen is locked. Generally, it would come up with a pop-up that would be some kind of a law enforcement type pop-up that threatened to say that you did something wrong and you had to pay to have your computer unlocked. You might get something that would look like an FBI pop-up or some kind of other pop-up, and again, they would demand payment to go ahead and unlock your computer. After that, we've now migrated, and these things are now going into the crypto locker type ransomware that actually hijacks your actual files, and you can't get access to your files until you go ahead and pay to get them back. So going back a little bit in this history here, there's just a couple of points I'd like to highlight. When these first came out, they typically made you pay the ransom. In the US, it was typically with a PaySafe card or a voucher that you could buy at like a CVS or something like that. And then they involved more to requiring Bitcoin, which is where most of these all are now, is just a Bitcoin payment. When we had just the ransomware that would lock your screen, they actually also became, back here in March of 2012, in this time frame, they became geolocation aware, so that they would actually pop up a law enforcement message that was specific to your geographic location. If you might get something for the, an FBI or local law enforcement in the US, and you would actually see an appropriate pop-up if you were in another country. And they've continued to evolve after that. After the pop-ups, then you can see over in October, you would not only get a pop-up, but they would start playing audio warnings as well. Then went into September of 2013, that's when we first started to see the breakouts of actually CryptoLocker. So that's where your files would actually get encrypted, and they would ask for a ransom to go ahead and get access to your files again. One thing, it's pretty much impossible to recover the files without the key, and that's really what they're selling you, is the key so that you can unencrypt your files again. And what would happen is if you didn't pay the ransom, the fee to go up would go up as time went by. They would generally give you maybe 3 to 5 days to pay the ransom, and if you didn't pay the ransom, then the price would go up. And their goal in this is to make money, mainly by Bitcoin now. So when this first started to hit, they saw about 250,000 victims around the world. And what this means, if you do get an infection, is, worst case, you're going to have temporary data loss until you either pay the ransom or you can restore your files. If you're not willing to pay the ransom, or if you can't restore the files, you could actually have, a permanent data loss. During that time, you can have no access to your computer or your applications, depending upon how widespread it is, and it's certainly going to be a disruption in your, your regular operations, as well as, financial loss from having to pay the ransom, downtime while you recover, and depending upon, how extensive it is, could also, potentially harm your organism's page. So this is the kind of screen you could actually see pop up on a workstation if you do get an infection. You get a pop-up that says your files are encrypted. You get a demand for payment. This here is another example of the same kind of thing that can happen. This particular screenshot right here, this actually gets put onto your desktop's background. This one happens to come from one of the newest variants of this called Locky, which I'll talk a little bit more later, but this is actually something that's only really come out in the last few months. So another example of of what you kind of see on your computer when you actually do get an infection. So when these things did come out, back in 2013, according to the FBI, they're estimating that these guys were making $1 million a day off of this, and that they made $27 million in the first 2 months. So this really is a lot of financial gain to be made by these people that are putting this stuff out. Between April 2014 and June 2015, there was over $18 million were paid for ransom to recover files, and that there were more than 6 million detected ransomware attacks in Q4 2015. And depending upon the estimates you look at, in the range of 50% or more of all malware attacks are now considered ransomware. So just kind of going back a little bit of our history. So, it first really began back in September of 2013, and then it wasn't long before December of 2013, we had CryptoLocker 2.0. One thing I kind of want to quickly point out here was that in May of 2014, they actually started to see Android Simple Locker, which it can actually attack your Android-based devices and lock them. The same thing, kind of request payment to get your access back to files off of an Android device. So with CryptoLocker 2.0, I kind of mentioned this. These first ransomwares had different options for payment. MoneyPack, Ucash, Bitcoin. With CryptoLocker 2.0 and beyond, they're primarily all Bitcoin now. Typical payment is going to be anywhere from ½ a Bitcoin to a Bitcoin, and that's going to vary depending upon what the price of a given Bitcoin is. But that can be ½ a Bitcoin, could be $220 to maybe $250. So you might be $400 to $500 for a full Bitcoin. Is typically what they're going to pay for, a small ransom, your typical ransom for, a single computer or two to get your files back. So this has been continuing to evolve with crypto defense, which is, these things are always evolving, and I just want to point out here that they then moved into using the Tor network to hide behind to make anonymous payments. So it's just another method they're using to cover their track. And again, this is the kind of thing you're going to see if they demand payment through Bitcoin. And making a payment through Bitcoin is not exactly the easiest thing in the world to do either. Talked a little about this, the Android Simple Locker. From everything I've seen, it really hasn't appeared too much in the United States yet, but that's probably only a matter of time. It seems to have really originated in the Ukraine. But in those cases, they are locking Android phones, encrypting their files off of the Android phone, and demanding payment to get your files back off of an Android device. So, kind of, who's doing all of this? It's really organized crime. On your scale of cyber attacks, we've got on the low end people who just kind of do it because they can. It's just they want to see what they can hack just to see what they can do. And then you do have criminals who try to vandalize websites, maybe steal technology, and then moving up the scale, you get hacktivists, who they do have an agenda and a goal, maybe politically or socially motivated. And then as we move up the scale, we get up into what we're dealing with here, which is organized crime. This malware, they've got significant economic gain. They have significant resources behind them. They're established, organized syndicates, organized crime organizations. Primarily, they're coming out of Russia and Eastern Europe. And they're doing things, with adware and IP theft and botnets, spamming campaigns, phishing campaigns, and of course all of that leads up to where we are now with ransomware. as well. And this just kind of, goes back and it just kind of shows too the same evolution. And all of these things are kind of cumulative and built on each other as well. So going back to 2001, our primary threats were, worm outbreaks and vulnerabilities. And then, that kind of moved into being combined with spam and mass mailing and spyware. And then with the, the evolution of botnets and, web threats and targeted attacks, it just kind of moves up the scale. So, we're up here, on this slide here from Trend Micro, we're up to 2015, we're 2016 now, where we're looking at, all these variants of CryptoLocker, and, it's kind of, everything's been built upon that to get where we are here, from all of these past vulnerabilities that are all still out there. But it's just been a continuing evolution. Again, there's really a great proliferation of all of this stuff now. These tools, you not only have organized, you not only have organizations out there that are organized, but they're actually selling these tools. They have developers. They're selling these tools. They're putting these tools out on the dark web, where pretty much anyone can go out there and buy these ransomware tools and start up their own operation. It's really unfortunate for all of us, but there's so many of these out there now, and it's proliferated so much, and it really comes down to, with these, with these hackers, it's really a low investment for them and a high rate of return. They can be getting $300, on the low end to get files back to maybe, up to $30,000 if they are successful in hitting a large enterprise. And they really don't care about, people's files either. If you get hit with this and, you don't want to pay the ransom, they're going to let the timer run out. They don't care if your files are encrypted. They're just going to go on, move on right on ahead to the next victim. So with this is just kind of to reinforce this whole evolution of, all of those different types of malware that have been out there, where we've gotten to. Again, these are organized criminal enterprises. They have developers. They're really businesses. They come out with a tactic, as we kind of saw a couple of slides ago, how malware has evolved. If the threat is not known, people aren't aware of it, they can make money. When things have gotten to the point where they're not working for them anymore, then they're going to come out with some kind of a new tactic, a new scheme, to try to make money. So I just want to go through some of these. There are countless variations of CryptoLocker, CryptoWall. It shows some of these different samples here of the ones that are out there. With the crypto variants, again, you can just see here another example of what you're going to get when one pops up. Just click through a couple of these here. Another one here, this one is using the Tor network in Bitcoin for payment, the CTB locker. And just to show, this is a screenshot I actually found here. This is actually from an actual Russian, I know the slide's kind of blurry. It's actually not in English, but this is actually from the Russian underground, a toolkit that they actually put out for sale, that people can just go out and buy and start their own ransomware campaign. With these tools, once your files are encrypted, it really is unencryptable. There really is no way to unencrypt your files without paying the ransom. And in most cases, they're even using a double encryption technology. They're now taking advantage of I2P network proxies and Tor network, not only for distribution and payment. They also, mostly the most likely way these are distributed is through spam email at this point. And we'll go into, I'll show a little bit more here in a moment about how it's evolved over the file types that they're encrypting as well. Some of these, like the torrent locker, if you do get infected, it will also harvest all of your email addresses, and then it will then go ahead and email itself out to everyone in your address list, which is one other reason why you can't actually trust an email from someone just because you know them. The newest iteration of this is Locky, which was on one of those screenshots that I showed earlier with the wallpaper. It does come out through spam email, and it can actually hit any files in any directory, not just local drives, not just map drives, but these newer variants are actually able to hit anything out there in the network that the user actually has access to. And yeah, okay, so again, so the ability to traverse network drives, even hit SANs, NASs, UNC paths, so anything that the user actually, that person has access to can be hit. They don't, even if they don't have to have it open, they don't have to have a drive mapped out, anything on the network out there that they've got access to can actually be hit and encrypt. That actually also includes things like Dropbox or other shared cloud storage systems. If you've got a connection open to them, these newer malware iterations can actually reach out across those and encrypt the files as well, which is something new that wasn't happening before. So this stuff isn't going anywhere. Back in June of 2014, there was a major international FBI takedown of the actual Zeus botnet network. They identified the malware writer that was originally responsible for CryptoWalker. He's still on the loose, and it kind of put a damper on them for a little while, but it wasn't long before they were back in business again. You know, they put a stop to some of this for a little while, and then they're just right back. It's just a kind of a game of whack-a-mole. Back in Q4 in 2006, we saw a 20% increase in ransomware samples. That's just, you know, new code, new malware that was out there. And again, it's just because of all this open source ransomware, the fact that it's sold in the black market. It's simple for different organizations to get their hands on this and create new attacks. At the same time, the older campaigns that were still out there, you know, the ones that started from 2013, 2014, they're still out there as well. And it's really because, you know, it's financially lucrative for these people to do this, and there's pretty much no chance they're going to get arrested, just because of all the international boundaries and everything that they have to hide, excuse me, that they have to hide behind. So I've got a couple of slides here just to kind of show the increase in ransomware. This one here is actually from McAfee. So we can see 2015 there was a huge jump in new ransomware from 2014, and the same thing again from McAfee. Q4 of 2015 is a almost triple total ransomware attacks from Q4 of 2014, where we had about 2.25 million, and we're up over 6 million now. This is just another slide. This one is from Bitdefender, just basically showing the same numbers again. They're pretty close to what McAfee was showing. He's got about 2.5 million back in Q4 of 2014, and we're approaching 6 million in 2015. And this really shows the shift too. So back in Q4 of 2014, 80% of ransomware attacks were the traditional ransomware that we looked at in the history. So those were the attacks you had with the fake antivirus, with the locking your screen, with the law enforcement lockdown, and about 20% of them were actually crypto ransomware related. Q4 of 2015, and that is completely swapped. So now we're looking at crypto related ransomware is 83%, and we're down to just 17% of the traditional ransomware with the fake AV and that type of thing. And that's really because of just the success they're having with ransomware, and also with the fake AV, with the law enforcement locking. People really just wised up to it. Cleanup of it isn't that big of a deal. It may have locked you out of your computer for a while, but it wasn't destructive and destroying files. With the ransomware, it's really been successful, and once they encrypt your files and have access to them and locked you out of them, they really have a captive audience at that point. So just to sum, all of that up, these are not just, script kiddies. These are, really organized crime that's out there. And with the ransomware, it's really, they're getting the most bang for their buck out of it. What they're also finding too is with these ransomware infections is they can also be leaving behind other backdoor Trojans as well. So packaged in with these ransomware attacks, they're finding backdoor Trojans that are left behind. In some cases, are banking Trojans looking to steal bank account information, account numbers, passwords, those kinds of things as well. So there's some interesting information here this was put out by Trend Micro. And what this is actually showing is that with Trend Micro's Smart Protection Network, they actually track when outbreaks happen. So what they actually found, this slide here was when they put out, it was from January of this year. All these little flags represent different regions in the world, and you'll notice they're Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. What they found, again, these are criminal organizations. They found that they are actually doing their attacks Tuesday through Friday. It seems that they take 3-day weekends for the most part, and most of these attacks are actually happening on these specific days of the week. Not to say that they don't or can't happen, but that's when they actually found the majority of them are actually happening. Same with Time A. These are, again, put out by Trend Micro from their Smart Protection Network, and they're actually finding that these campaigns are actually happening during standard business hours, with the highest level of attacks coming between about 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. In your particular time zone. So these are not just spam spam attacks that just go out. They're specifically targeted for specific days of the week, specific times of day when people are actually working. So a couple of examples. I don't know if anyone's heard of these. These have all been in the news. This one was very recently, the Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. They actually ended up paying $17,000 in ransom to actually get their files back. The entire hospital was reduced to basically paper for about a week while they were down from this attack. Another one was the Methodist Hospital in Kentucky. They did not pay the ransom. From everything I've read about this one, they were actually, able to recover and restore all their files. But they were down for 5 days. They declared an internal state of emergency, and it took them 5 days to get operations back in place again. And I mean, it can hit anyone. This case here, it was actually the Swansea, in Massachusetts, Swansea Police Department actually paid $750 to recover their files. So I mentioned before that these typically, while there are other methods, the most typical method for these to spread is through spam. So with a typical spam attack, spam is sent typically from spam bots, or they typically come from known spammers or compromised machines. And then they may contain malware along with that. But those traditional spam attacks, any decent spam filter out there from just about any vendor is going to block 98 to 99% of all of that spam. But what's been now with these crypto outbreaks is these are targeted attacks. They're socially engineered attacks. They can be coming from what you would consider to be a known or safe sender, or at least what would appear to be a safe sender. The payload of the actual malware is actually downloaded after you open up the email. The malware is not necessarily encoded in the actual spam itself. So that's one thing that's really important with these, is they're actually getting through quite a few spam filters just because of really the simplicity of the messages. And I'm going to go ahead and show some examples of those in the next few slides. But as you could see from the time and day of when these attacks take place, they're actually harvesting. They're not just spamming out random addresses. They're targeting specific people, specific users. They're getting addresses of specific users in organizations and directly sending email to them. So what happens once you actually get one of these emails and you open it up? I'm just going to go through that here briefly, because then we can talk about a little bit later some things that can be done to actually help prevent what happens at these different steps. So you're going to get a spam email, which is going to have an attachment, or it's going to have a link to a malicious URL. Somebody opens that, or they click on that URL, or they open the attachment, and then what happens is the actual malware itself, the crypto locker, crypto wall, whatever variant it may be, is then it actually downloaded at that point, and then it's executed, and it goes ahead and it tries to install itself on the computer, put itself into the auto start, inject its malicious code onto the computer. And then it's going to reach out to a command and control server. And that's the point where it's going to exchange encryption keys from the command and control server. And once it gets that, it's going to go ahead and it's going to start to encrypt all of the files on that computer. And then depending upon the actual variant of the crypto locker or crypto wall or whatever it may be, it's going to depend on how far it's able to spread. And then it's going to go ahead and, it's going to pop up one of those ransom notes that we had looked at earlier. One thing now too that they are actually, like with the new CryptoWall 4, when they actually complete their encryption of files, they're actually going ahead and uninstalling themselves. You know, by the time you get the ransomware notice pop up on the screen, it's very possible that the actual ransomware has actually removed itself from the computer, and it just makes it that much harder to for them to be tracked down later in the future. So with the evolution of this, I just want to point out that back in 2014, if you look at the middle row here, we can see that there were about 40 different file extensions that they looked for to encrypt. Where if we move back up here to CryptoWall version 4, which we saw in October of 2015, they're now looking at about 358 different file types that they're encrypting. So these things are certainly getting, you know, not just more, not just getting, what I want to say, there's not just more infections, they're more sophisticated, but they're actually doing more damage now as well. Now, this is one that I actually have not seen anywhere come up myself personally, but it is one thing to be aware of and to look for. With these torrent locker outbreaks, what will happen is you'll get a spam email, someone will click on a link, and what it'll do is it'll bring them to a landing page with a CAPTCHA that looks, I don't know if it's not too good in the slide here, but it's not quite your typical CAPTCHA in that with these ransomware and these malware, they tend to only have numbers in them. And the reason being is they don't want you to fail when you try to type in the CAPTCHA. And this is just another way that they're trying to circumvent antivirus software, security. You know, when they get you to these CAPTCHAs, it's just another method they're trying to hide behind. But the thing I want to point out here is, you know, if you ever, first of all, I wouldn't ever recommend clicking on a link from any of these suspicious emails, but if you ever see anything with a CAPTCHA like this, don't ever fill it out, you know, especially when you get ones like this that are numbers only, because they could very well be malware. You know, it's again, because they don't want you to fail in filling out the CAPTCHA. That's why there's no letters or special characters in them or anything like that. Got some of the samples here of different spam messages that actually include some of this CryptoLocker, CryptoWall payloads. A lot of times they come through in zip attachments, and they tend to be very simple emails. So it's a lot of times it's a giveaway when you get an email that has a very simple message like this. And again, they can come from people you know and trust. So just because you get an email from someone and say, "Oh yeah, I know Bob. Bob's good. I can open this email," you know, that might not be the case. You know, they can masquerade as faxes. This is another one that comes through as a fax, and you can see a link here. They want you to click on a Dropbox link. Orders, another common one, is to try to trick people into thinking, you know, they've got a problem with some kind of an order somewhere. Invoicing is another big one. Seen quite a few of those where emails come through and with, you know, they're kind of vague. You know, something comes through, it just says, you know, hey, there's a problem with this invoice. You know, please open the attachment to review the invoice. The resume ones are another one targeted for HR people. They're a big target because they actually do get resumes. I've seen that one quite a bit as well. Another sample here where they can come through looking like something from the IRS or a federal tax payment, or appearances, can be targeted for not just, not specifically legal offices, but, for anybody. That's another common one too, is they can show up appearing to look like something like a court appearance notice. So I do want to talk a little bit more about the newest variation of this, which is the locky ransomware. This one is a little bit different in that it will come through typically as a Word document. So you can get an email similar to the ones we just looked at. You won't have a zip attachment, but you'll just have a Word document. Now, embedded in that Word document will be a malicious macro that will then go ahead and try to download the payload and execute and encrypt your files. This is important because for quite some time, Microsoft has actually, by default, disabled macros in Word. So if you have re-enabled macros, I would strongly suggest disabling them. If the user does click on one of those Word documents, it's down in the bottom of the slide here. It may not be too clear, but if you do try to open a Word document with macros, you will actually get a pop-up from Word, a security warning, saying that macros have been disabled, and you get the option to click on the button to enable content. That's important because a lot of users will not think twice about it and just say, oh yeah, I can just click OK, and they'll enable it. And that's all it takes. A very unsuspicious, innocuous-looking Word document in an email. You open it, you get a pop-up that says, macros are disabled, would you like to enable? And the user goes, yeah, sure, click, and you're infected. That's as quick as that. Yeah, this is just to kind of summarize some of the things we talked about, the ways, we looked at the ways that they can be distributed. You can get embedded URLs in your emails that can redirect you. So you can not only have a URL that will just download the payload, but there can be URLs in there that are trying to redirect you to malicious sites that are going to go ahead and infect you. They may be compromised sites that could be legitimate sites, and these links could be trying to redirect you to those as well. What happens if you're locked out? There's really not a lot of options. Once your files are encrypted, there's really no way to unencrypt them unless you pay. If you pay, it's like the bully on the schoolyard. You're a target, and they're going to probably try to come back at you again. If you don't pay, then you're going to have a backup or some other way to recover your files. If you do actually see one of those pop-ups showing that your files, are encrypted, you're getting a ransom demand, the very first thing you want to do is disconnect that computer from the network. Turn it off, unplug its network card. If it's a laptop, put it in airplane mode, get it off the network. The second you suspect ransomware is hit the computer. Even when you get to the point when you've recognized it, you want to remove it. You want that computer off the network until it's cleaned, or more likely formatted and reinstalled. Data recovery. Again, once these things hit, unless you pay the ransom, there's no way to unencrypt the files. You're going to have to restore any of your files from a good backup, which means you've got to know that you've got good backups. You're going to have to, know where you've got to restore everything to, and depending upon the size and scope of the infection, that could really take a while. In some cases, it can just take a while just to determine what machine or machines are actually infecting and encrypting the files on the network, because it may not always be apparent. These infections can hit a machine. It'll start encrypting the files on the local machine. Then they'll reach out to the network and they'll start encrypting the files on the network. Typically, what happens is someone will go to open a Word document or Excel document or something, and they go to open it, and it's just a big scrambled mess. Just a bunch of random characters, letters, numbers, special symbols when you try to open the file because it's been encrypted. And at that point, it's probably not done doing its damage. It's still running in the background in someone's computer. It's crawling through the network and encrypting your files. So at that point, you may not have even seen a ransomware demand pop up on a workstation yet to even know where it came from. So, the question always comes up: do you pay the ransom? Or you don't pay the ransom? Really, the only reason to pay the ransom is if it's a last resort. If you have no backup of your data and there's no other way to get it back, you may want to pay the ransom. The best bet is have good backups, or take steps and never obviously get it in the first place. But that's really the reason why someone would want to pay. There's a lot of reasons not to pay. If you do pay, like I mentioned earlier, you do become a target, and they may try to hit you again. It just provides more motivation from them. It also, paying, also increases, the risk of other kinds of attacks as well on your network. And when you do pay, you're funding these cybercrime organizations so that they can go ahead and develop new malware and and commit further fraud. And the last thing too is, for the most part, if you do pay, typically they will restore your files, because if they didn't, no one would ever pay. But there are cases where people have paid and they still didn't get their files back. So that's always a possibility as well. And last, if you don't pay, if you don't have a backup, you could lose everything, and you have to start completely from scratch again, which is very expensive and time-consuming, and you could lose all of your history from the past if you don't have a valid backup to go restore from. So that kind of gets into what do you do? So number one, backup, backup, backup. So for everything that's out there, make sure you've got regular and consistent backups, and also make sure you're testing your backups. Make sure that there's no time like having a crisis, whether it's a ransomware infection or even a hardware failure, or whatever it may be. There's no time. That's not the time you want to test your backup to see if it works. You want to be going ahead and testing and make sure that you can restore things before the emergency comes up. The other thing too is also have a copy, have multiple redundant backups. It's a very good idea to have an offsite and offline backup as well. So again, there's no protection from ransomware without a backup. There's so many variations of this stuff out there. It's socially engineered. It's targeted. All it can take is a slip up of a mind lapse of an employee for a couple of seconds to open something they shouldn't, and you can be hit by this. So again, backups are crucial. But just something to think about is, how frequently do you back up your data, not just on your PC, but on your server or your network? Do you know how fast you can restore that data if you need to? And for certain data, do your employees, are they able to restore anything on their own if they need to? If they've got things saved on their own laptops or remote users, are they backing stuff up, and can they restore it as well if they get hit by something? And again, redundant backups. It's a good idea to have not only your on-site backup, but an off-site backup with a cloud provider as well, or at least if you've got multiple sites, have a backup stored at more than one location. One other thing to consider is if you do have multiple locations and you're doing file replication, that is not a safeguard against this. If you have, a location A and you're replicating those files across a WAN link or a VPN or something to location B, in another state or another city, and one of those offices gets hit with a crypto locker type infection, and those files start to get encrypted. If you're replicating those files to another location, that encryption is gonna replicate over as well. So it's important to recognize when that happens. Go ahead and temporarily stop that replication before all those files at the other location get hit as well. Another thing, especially with the latest variations of these, the way they can just hit everything on a network a user has access to. If you've got backups that are just connected out to a shared drive on the network, they could be vulnerable. Especially if you've got, an office manager or something who logs onto the computer with admin rights and has network admin rights. If that person were, logged in with all of those permissions and launched one of these malware attacks, it could potentially even hit backups if you just had them sitting out there, on a network drive somewhere. Because really, this has really changed very recently. It used to be that these things would just tend to hit mapped drives. So, you've got your C drive, your D drive, or whatever local drives you had on your computer, and then people would tend to have, an F and G and H drive or whatever letter mapped out to their server. These ransomware, they'll certainly hit those mapped drives. So if at all possible, it's a good idea to get away from using mapped network drives and teach people how to use shared UNC paths. Although the newer variations of this are even hitting those, but there are still enough previous versions of this stuff still floating around out there that do only hit, that will only look for mapped network drives. That it's not a bad idea to try to get away from that if at all possible. So email filtering and phishing awareness. So when these messages, if they do actually make it in, you need to actually, don't click on these links without really scrutinizing the email. Like I said, they can potentially come from someone you trust. Any inbound emails need to go through a proper virus scanner, spam filters. They should all be filtered before they ever get into your organization. So if you do have on-premise email servers, that's one reason why you want to have use a cloud filtering service and make sure that this stuff is filtered out in the cloud so you can get rid of as much as possible before it ever gets in the door and onto your network. You obviously want to block out any dangerous email attachments, EXE, scripts, JavaScript. Zip and RAR files are a very common way that this stuff spreads. A lot of companies, a lot of people do email zip files back and forth. I would really recommend not emailing them back and forth because so much of this stuff does come through zip files. If you need to send something, a larger attachment that you need to zip, you might want to look at some other sharing solution to get that to the person you want to send it to. Mentioned the locky and the macro content. Really want to make sure that that's blocked as well. Whether you're scanning and blocking for macro content, or you're just not letting that stuff in your email policies to begin with. So one thing it's important to make sure that everyone in your organization is aware of these threats, you know, to pass on the information, what these things look like, what they want to look out for. As a general rule with these email messages, if you look at it and something doesn't look right, it's probably not, you know, don't open it, get rid of it. If there's a link in the email that wants to direct you, you know, somewhere, a bank or wherever it may be, even if you're, you know, expecting an email, if you're not sure, don't click on the link, go directly to your browser, you know, bring up the address for that bank or whatever organization that is from your favorites, or type in the address. Don't use the actual link in the email. Many of the links that come through in the email are very similar to legitimate links. They may only be off somewhere by, you know, one character in a domain name, and it's very easy to overlook that. You know, when you just kind of glance at the link in the email. So, yeah, again, this is just, you know, just what I've been talking about. There are sites out there where you can copy and paste the link into, and it'll analyze the site or the URL and tell you if it looks to be a threat or not. So one here is sitesafety.trendmicro.com. There are other vendors who provide the same kinds of links as well. Just realized on the time, so I'm going to kind of move a little bit quicker here. Antivirus, you know, obviously keep all your antivirus up to date. Go ahead and make sure you patch all of your software. It's going to skip ahead here. Patches and software. Be sure that everything gets patches. So according to UC CERT reports, that proactive patching can eliminate 85% of cyber attacks. This includes ransomware. So patch Windows and your core operating systems, as well as your third-party plugins and other applications, because you got to remember that that's really where these hackers look to start their attacks. A lot of times is in vulnerabilities in third-party applications. And if you don't need these third-party applications on your computer, you know, it's a good idea to go ahead and turn them off. That includes things like Flash and Java. There have been many cases. You know, there was one specifically from last year. There was a new CryptoLocker variant that specifically was looking to attack a vulnerability through Adobe Flash. So, patching, you know, keeping all of your, not just your antivirus software up to date, but all of your third-party applications is very important as well. With that, also your perimeter devices, your firewall, you know, it's important to replace outdated firewalls and network perimeter devices. If they're more than a few years old, they probably don't have the capability to analyze and look for a lot of these things or block them. I've got a few screenshots here. This is from a Dell SonicWall, an NSA level device, which is more of an enterprise level device. But you can see, so down on the bottom towards the left, with the advanced app control, some of the things we saw in a lot of the slides were that the fact that these crypto lockers are taking advantage of the Tor network. So in something like with a higher end firewall, a newer firewall, you're going to have the ability to go ahead and block access to those specific kinds of things. They also have botnet filters built in where they keep track of known, the known command and control servers, and they're going to block the connections to them. Those servers are always changing and updating, but without a device that's able to, tie into block lists on the back end, you're not going to be able to block those with an older firewall that doesn't have that capability. And the same thing with the GeoIP filters. Those are newer features that you're not going to have in older firewalls. A lot of this malware all comes from, like I mentioned before, overseas, Russia, Eastern European countries. China. If you don't have any reason to do business with those countries, with a device that has a GeoIP filter, you could just block all traffic to and from those countries. One of the other things that can be done is to prevent this malware from actually executing. So once someone does click on, they click on attachment, they click on a URL, it has to try to download and install itself onto a computer. One thing that can be done is there are application policies that can be applied either through GPO or other third-party tools that will help prevent those unwanted applications from running in the typical locations that they try to run on. You certainly never want to have RDP open out to the internet. There's too many vulnerabilities in that, and it's a direct method of attack for these malware. Mapped drives, again, I mentioned mapped drives, limit access, limit control as far as access control, only give users absolutely only what they really need to have access to. You know, don't give anonymous or full access to all of your shares on the network, because when one of these does hit, it's going to be able to crawl the network, and whatever permission that user has is what it's going to be able to encrypt. So yeah, we just talked about the firewall. So to kind of sum a lot of this stuff up, you know, be aware of, you know, the fact that these are social engineering attacks. One of the ones I don't know if I mentioned before, typically they do come along as FedEx or UPS or Postal Service emails. That's very common. Legal requests. Look out for the CAPTCHAs. If in doubt, you know, close your browser and manually type in the address or use it from a favorite. Don't open any attachments unless you're actually expecting an email with an attachment. And, you know, like I said, when in doubt, go ahead and use your browser and bring up the same effort or manually type in the address that you know is good. When a computer is compromised, get it off the network as soon as you can. Also, if you do have an infection, you're going to want to restrict write access to your shared folders or to your servers. Whether that means, you know, disconnecting your server from the network or adjusting your permissions so people can only read, but you want to prevent anything from being written that could potentially continue the encryption process out on your network. All of the antivirus vendors will tell you to contact law enforcement. The reality of it is, if you're hit with a malware and you've got a ransom of, you know, $250, $300, $400, you know, and these hackers are sitting in the Ukraine or Chechnya or, you know, who knows where they are, you can contact law enforcement, but the reality of it, you know, not much is going to happen. You know, unless you happen to be a Hollywood Presbyterian hospital who has a $17,000 ransom, then, you know, the FBI will get involved. You know, otherwise, you know, you can contact law enforcement. If you have your data and your network insured for data loss, then, you know, you might want to contact law enforcement just to get that recorded in case you have to actually make a claim. So for IT managers, this is crucial. Ensure that programs and users of computers use the lowest level privileges necessary to complete a task. What that means, users should not have admin privileges. They should not have admin privileges on their computers. They should have user access. You certainly should not have people logging in, whether that's an office manager or a network admin. They should not be logging in and doing their day-to-day tasks as a network administrator. If someone's logged in as a network admin and they get hit by one of these, it's going to take out your entire network. Make sure autoplay is disabled. So, you know, removable or network drives, it just makes it a little bit harder for these things to possibly execute. If you don't need file sharing on a computer or a server, you know, don't turn it on. these things, once they try to encrypt something, they're looking for file shares and access out there to encrypt more. So we only want to share the absolute minimum, what needs to be shared. Use ACLs. So, again, we don't want to give read access to everyone on a particular share, or full access to everyone on a particular share. Users should only have access to the things on the network that they need access to. And disable. We shouldn't have anonymous browsing. Full access to everything. And the standard stuff, as I mentioned before, educate your users what they need to look out for. Make sure you've got strong password policies. Patch all of your computers and all of those third-party applications, which often gets overlooked, and backups. That's crucial. Make sure everything's backed up, and not only backups, but you've got redundant backups as well. So I know I went over a little bit here, but at this point, if anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer them.
Thanks, Tim. I'll go ahead and unmute lines here for anyone who has a mic or is on the phone. You're welcome to ask your questions directly to Tim. No questions, anyone?
No. Now, if we don't have any questions, then we can go ahead and wrap this up.
Okay, thanks everyone for attending, and please look out for information we send out periodically on our upcoming webinars. We do have another webinar coming up next month in July on SharePoint. We encourage you to join that one. It's a great overlook tool if you may currently have SharePoint as a standalone, or if you're currently utilizing Office 365, it is available in that suite as well. So again, thanks for attending.